Let's turn our Bibles to the 19th chapter of Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 19 is where we'll be picking up tonight. And as you're turning in your Bibles, I wanted to show, here's a picture of some braids. And, braids are beautiful. I dig braids. And, of course, the whole dragon thing is the big rave currently, the dragon braid. But if you at first glance, when you look at a braid, it looks like two strands. It looks like two locks of hair that have just kind of been twisted around, and you can't really see the three that makes up a braid until you start to undo it. Solomon said in Ecclesiastes chapter 4:21 that a threefold cord is not easily broken, and many of that theme, I think, is going to figure into many of our verses tonight as we continue our study of Proverbs. Whether it would be the threefold cord of the home, or the threefold cord of brotherhood, or within an employee-employee relationship, whatever it might be. So let's go ahead and look in verse 1 of chapter 19. Better is the poor who walks in his integrity than one who is perverse in his lips and is a fool. And also, it is not good for a soul to be without knowledge. And he sins who hastens with his feet. As I've been doing throughout our study of Proverbs, I've leaned quite a bit on some various different modern language, modern English versions, some of the more contemporary paraphrases and stuff. And I'll be doing that tonight too. I've got maybe 4 or 5 of the old, not so contemporary, but the Good News Bible, and also the NIV. And the Good News Bible of this verse says, "Enthusiasm without knowledge is not good, and impatience will get you into trouble." You know, we've all heard Ben Franklin's "haste makes waste," and it's kind of that same idea. The foolishness of a man twists his way, and his heart frets against the Lord. Wealth makes many friends, but the poor is separated from his friend. That's true, isn't it? I mean, somebody hits the lotto, and boy, they've got all kinds of friends then. Relatives they never heard of, and it seems like because a lot of the celebrities are, many of them anyway, are what, kind of the new money sort of class of people, where they came from somewhat humble beginnings, and then all of a sudden, or over a period of time, they hit this great stardom, whether it's talking about actors or entertainers, musicians, and so forth, or sports guys, and they go from being in a middle class or lower middle class environment to having multiple tens of millions of dollars. And the only friend, and you look at Hollywood and how much of a bubble it seems like so many of the Hollywood people live in. I mean, they're just in this very insulated and isolated bubble. They don't have any idea what it's really like to live outside of Glitterville. And the only friends that they can have are the other celebrities that are just as plastic as they are. And, that's really got to be somewhat of a enviable existence, I think, or non-enviable existence to have, where, how could they really know if their relationships are real or genuine? The foolishness of a man twists his way, and his heart frets against the Lord. Wealth makes many friends. Oh, sorry, backed up too far. A false witness, verse 5, will not go unpunished, and he who speaks lies will not escape. The truth will find you out. Many entreat the favor of the nobility, and every man is a friend to him who gives gifts. I don't know if this is meant to be negative, probably is, but it could just be saying that a guy that's a giving person is oftentimes a very liked person. Not so much for his gifts, but they just have that winsome kind of personality. But it could be saying that everybody always wants to rub elbows and drop the names of those that are of the A team. Verse 7, all the brothers of the poor hate him. How much more do his friends go far from him? If even a man's own family turns against the poor, many of the Proverbs are not so much an indictment or an endorsement as they are just simply a statement of fact. And I think this is one of those. He who gets wisdom loves his own soul, and he who keeps understanding will find good. repeating what he said earlier, a false witness will not go unpunished, and he who speaks lies will perish. Luxury is not fitting for a fool, much less for a servant to rule over princes. I like the word luxury here is in the New King or Old King James, it's the word delight. Literally, it's the word daintiness. Kind of picture in your mind the Louis XIV France, with all the frills and the lace and the cream-filled bonbons and all of that. This is for a fool to live in that kind of luxury. It's just kind of incongruent. I think it was Eugene Peterson said, much less an employee telling his boss what to do. The discretion of a man makes him slow to anger, and his glory is to overlook a transgression. Not all transgression, but sometimes there's a place where, you've heard me talk about the 13th or the 11th commandment, get thee over it. Just let it pass. It's not that important. Let it go. And it's his glory for a man to overlook that. A king's wrath is like the roaring of a lion. He's going to repeat that again later. But his favor is like the dew on the grass. What Solomon is saying here is that a king's job is to be able to be wrathful when it's time to be wrathful, and to be gracious when it's time to be gracious. There's a time when people should fear the king, and there's a time when they should rejoice at his appearing. A foolish son is the ruin of his father, and the contentions of a wife are a continual dripping. Remember Chinese water torture? How they would strap the guy down and then just start dripping one drip at a time. Just one drip of water on the guy's forehead. And before long, it was just unbearable. How many of you ever heard of the brown noise? Anybody? Okay, not too many have. It's kind of an urban myth sort of thing, but it all began with this project of the Air Force back in the 50s, where they were trying to build a prop-driven airplane that could be supersonic, that could break the sound barrier. And they came up with this XF-84H Thunder Screech that supposedly emitted this sound. It just had one 3-bladed propeller, but it emitted this sound that made the ground crew nauseous. And you can just let your own imagination know why it was called the brown note. But here's an example of what the brown note sounds like. Oh, yeah, I guess we'll have to have some sound. Okay. Let me back that up. Let's do that again. Could you imagine that incessantly? Could you imagine that hour after hour, day after day? After a while, it would become pretty unbearable. And that's kind of the idea that Solomon is talking about with the contentious wife. And a guy that had 1,000 of them probably knew what he was talking about in this subject. Houses and riches are an inheritance from fathers, but a prudent wife is from the Lord. A father can pass on anything that he owns, anything that he has acquired throughout life, but he can't give you a good wife. eHarmony can't give you a good wife. A singles ministry in a church can't give you a good wife. Certainly a nightclub can't do it. But the only one that can do that is the Lord. A prudent wife is from the Lord. Remember, he who gets a wife gets a good thing. And that comes from the Lord. Laziness casts one into a deep sleep, and an idle person will suffer hunger. He who keeps the commandment keeps his soul, but he who is careless of his ways will die. Those of you that are familiar with Solomon's life, he was given by God to be the wisest man that ever lived. And he was blessed by his father with unlimited riches, and also the Lord as well. Not a lot of riches, but it was apparently unlimited. It says that in the days of Solomon, silver was counted like clay. To have a silver utensil was just like having a pottery. If you had a silver bowl, that was just like a pottery bowl. No big deal. I mean, when you read some of the stories about how Solomon lived and how opulent and luxurious his life was and how much God had given him, and plus all of the wisdom that was from the Lord as well. Don't you kind of wish that sometimes he would have followed his own advice? You know, when you read the book of Proverbs and you think, Saul, what was wrong with you? But then, you know, when I look back on my last 30 years of pastoral, 30 plus years now of pastoral ministry, how I wish there's oftentimes I would have practiced what I preached. You know, there's things that I have said really well from the pulpit, pat myself on the back as I'm walking down, and then just have the Lord bless me with the fact that that's not really the way I do it, though, you know. But then before you get too judgmental with me, how many of you have done the same thing? You know, I mean, you said things. There's a difference between the things you say and the things you do. I think that we're all that way. And this is a warning, I think, from Solomon to not let that happen. He who has pity on the poor lends to the Lord, and he will pay back what he has given. Now, there is, probably most of you are not familiar with this, and that's okay. And this isn't really, I'm not criticizing or putting down this approach that many churches have. But a lot of times when we even have, there's not a day goes by that I don't get an email from one of these outfits. But there are many churches that when they want to have some sort of a fund building campaign, you know, they're wanting to buy their building or build a building or something like that, and they need to get a bunch of money, they'll actually have this outfit that will come in and they will start issuing bonds. And they'll do this big bond issue thing for the church, and they talk about how you bring this money in now, and then it's going to give you this much return in 5 years, and it'll all be paid back, and you'll all of this sort of thing. And the phrase that I've heard them say oftentimes is that you can. Why wouldn't you want to lend to the Lord? Because he's such a good. He's got a good credit rating, you know, and so they'll talk about lending to the Lord. That's not what Solomon's talking about here. When he says, he who gives to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will pay back what he's given. This is talking about this is charity and looking out for the disenfranchised, not trying to build a bigger building. Chasten your son while there is hope, and do not set your heart on his destruction. If that's a little unclear, let's look at what the NIV has to say. It says, discipline your son, for in that there is hope. Do not be a willing party to his death. There's that. And I think the same thing would be true of when it comes to daughters. Now, the problem is, and I got a friend that's down, I can never remember whether it's New Zealand or Australia where this came from, but they had passed a law a few years back where it was illegal for parents to spank their children. They passed a law that they didn't call it the anti-spanking law. You know, they didn't say that they were putting a ban upon spanking. They weren't stopping discipline. They were going to stop the parents from beating their children. They were going to stop their parents from hitting their children. That's the terminology. That's the way they spun it in order to sell it through their parliament and to get the law passed. And I think it's pretty inarguable to understand that the Bible very clearly teaches what today we would call corporal punishment, spanking. And thankfully, it's not against the law in America yet. But Lord tarries, that day is probably not far off. I think the important thing to understand, though, is that when it comes to parenting, there needs to be a very clear distinction between punishment and discipline. I don't think parents are ever called to punish their children, but I think parents are very much called to discipline their children. Now, somebody could say, you know, man, you're just splitting hairs. That's being semantic. You're just, that doesn't make any sense. Well, regardless of what you call it, I think that there is a very clear distinction between them. And the difference between punishment and discipline, I think, could be best understood with two questions. One is, how is it administered? In other words, is it done in anger or is it done in love? And then secondly, what is the goal? You know, is it correction or is it punitive? Is it an attempt to try to punish the child for what they've done? It does no good to punish a child. It does a lot of good to discipline them. Discipline is for the purpose of changing behavior. Punishment is just merely punitive. That's why people go to penitentiaries. So I think just asking those two questions, is it done in anger and love, or is the goal to improve the behavior through correction, or is it just simply to punish the misbehavior? Verse 19, a man of great wealth will suffer punishment, for if you rescue him, you'll have to do it again. You know, if that was true in Solomon's day, boy, in this day of executive kidnapping and so forth, you know, the corporate kidnappings that take place, that's very true. Listen to counsel and receive instruction, that you may be wise in your latter years. There are many plans in a man's heart. Nevertheless, the Lord's counsel, that will stand. You know, we can make all the plans that we want to, but if we don't include, if we include the Lord in it, if He's the one that is the factor of those plans, then that'll be established. But if we just kind of give lip service to Him, who knows what the outcome will be. What is desired in a man is kindness, and a poor man is better than a liar. It's better to be a poor man than to be dishonest, he says. The fear of the Lord leads to life. This is a little different than all the other. We've seen many previous fears of the Lord, but usually it'll say the fear of the Lord is. And this time it doesn't say that. It just says the fear of the Lord leads to life, and he who has it will abide in satisfaction. He will not be visited with evil. Now, let's look at what this is not saying before we can understand what it is saying. You know, this is not saying that someone who fears the Lord will never have hard times. This is not saying that somebody who fears the Lord, that nothing ever bad will ever happen to him. We can all know of too many exceptions to that. So that can't be what he's saying when he says he will not be visited with evil. But what he's saying is the fear of the Lord leads to life. That which we fear, we will obey. Okay? I have a fear of burning my hand. So therefore, I view a hot stove with a lot of reverential awe. You know, I fear that stove, and that's going to lead to life. That's going to lead to me being burned. And so I don't have to suffer being burned because I fear the stove that is hot, and I stay away from it. I think that's what he's saying. I won't be visited with the evil of getting my hands burnt because I have fear for the hot stove. The lazy man buries his... I love this one. The lazy hand get this imagery, okay? Just get a mental picture in your mind of this. The lazy man buries his hand in the bowl, and then will not so much as bring it to his mouth again. Now, if you got the old King James, it says bosom. The lazy man puts his hand in his bosom and won't bring it back out again. And the king, for some reason, the old King James at this point is taking it from the Septuagint, the Greek translation, which it got off there. But it's really saying that you know, in those days they would have the communal meal where they'd all be sitting around the table and they have this big bowl of beans there in the middle, and they just break off the pita and dip it in there and get them a hunk of it and eat that way. And it's saying the lazy man is the person that would take off the pinch of bread and reach over into the bowl and then just think, oh, that's so much work. And so they just stay there, you know. I ain't never going to be accused of being lazy, I can tell you that. I mean, somebody too lazy to eat? I don't get that. And I think the same holds true for the Bible. You know, I mean, this is our daily bread. And I think far too often we can be spiritually lazy, that we can sit down and we can think, well, you know, okay, I better do my devos. And so we open it up, and then we immediately fall asleep. Strike a scoffer, and the simple will become wary. You know, if you strike somebody who deserves to be struck, then the simple people will take heed after that. Rebuke one who has understanding, and he will discern knowledge. He who mistreats his father and chases away his mother is a son who causes shame and brings reproach. You know, the Old Testament law said that when you had a son that did that, they were to be taken into the city and stoned by the city's inhabitants. Not saying we should do that today, but I bet they didn't have many kids who brought reproach on their parents in those days. Cease listening to instruction, my son, and you will stray from the words of knowledge. A disreputable witness scorns justice, and the mouth of the wicked devours iniquity. Judgments are prepared for scoffers, and beatings for the backs of fools. I was listening to Damien Kyle today, and he said he saw a bumper sticker that said, "Stupid should hurt." Amen. That's Bible. Okay. Chapter 20. Wine is a mocker, and strong drink a brawler, and whoever is led astray by it is not wise. Or again, let's turn to the New Good News Bible. It says, drinking too much makes you loud and foolish. It's stupid to get drunk. Now it says, wine is a mocker, and strong drink a brawler. If you look in the New King James, or the New International Version, it says, wine is a mocker, and beer is a brawler, and whoever led astray by them is not wise. Why beer in place of strong drink? I mean, don't be thinking of a bottle of Corona with a lime sticking out of the top of it. You know, it's not talking about that. This isn't the beer in those days. The Egyptians were the ones that had the corner on the market, and I mean, they did this thing with some barley and hops, and it was beer, but the alcoholic content on it was like 5 times that of the wine. I mean, it was the wild turkey of the Bible times, you know, and so wine makes you stupid, but a strong drink gets you a black eye and a broken nose. I'll have more to say about this next week when we get to chapter 23. But let me just say, I will just say right now, I'm of the side that doesn't like this current deal of that's so hip and contemporary today about Christians drinking. I can't drink. Maybe you can. Maybe you can. I can't. It's not legalism. And it's not because I'm a pastor. I mean, I quit drinking long before I got in the ministry. I quit drinking when I dedicated my life to Jesus Christ and became a representative of His. But I'll talk about that next week. The wrath of a king, verse 2, is like the roaring of a lion. Whoever provokes him to anger sins against his own life. That's a good one. It's honorable for a man to stop striving. You know, there is a time when you should stand up to somebody. There is a time when striving is called for. But there's also an honor that comes to the man who can bring an end to it, that can stop it. Any fool can start a quarrel. A lazy man will not plow because of winter, and he will beg during harvest and have nothing. Now, in order to understand this fully, you got to understand what it's like over in Israel. They don't have winters like we do. They don't get that hard freeze and the 3 feet of snow, and you know, the kids had to walk through it 5 miles uphill both ways, you know, barefooted. They don't have that over there. They have their seasons, but they're not quite as extreme as ours can be here. And in their wintertime, it might get down to freezing. And I've actually seen snow flurries in Jerusalem before. You'll get the dusting, and it's only until you get way up in the like Hermon that you actually see snow accumulation. But it doesn't really get. They in their seasons they have 2 periods of rain. They have one that's in the late fall, and then the other one that comes in the early spring. It's called the early and the latter rains. The early ones are in the late fall, and the latter ones are in the early spring. After the early rains in the wintertime, around the 1st of December, January, right in that time period, that's the best time to do the plowing. You get the ground prepared for the seed, and you plant it then. And then when the latter rains come in the spring, it reaps the harvest. And so somebody who is too lazy to go do that in the wintertime, they say, oh, it's just too cold. I don't want to put on my overcoat. Well, then when the harvest time comes, they'll be begging food. Verse 5, counsel in the heart of man is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out. You know, and that's kind of the role of a good counselor, I think, is to be able to bring out what's going on with the person that's seeking counsel. Most men will proclaim each his own goodness, but who can find a faithful man? I love, many of the Proverbs in this section are those antithetical ones, the contrasting ones, where there'll be the first part of the couplet, the first line of the proverb will say this, and then the second line will begin with but. There's this, but, and then what follows. It's the antithesis of it. And sometimes it's interesting to see what those contrasts are when you compare the two. Most men will proclaim each his own goodness. Every man wants to tell you about their accomplishments. Every man wants to tell you about all the things that he does good. That's just something that's part of human nature. But, Solomon says, the antithesis of that is, who can find a faithful man? And I think what he's talking about is that within each man and woman, we all have multiple personality disorder. We all have. I mean, there's within each of us there are three people. There's the first one, who we think we are, and then the second one is who we want others to think we are, and then the third one is who we are. We all have that within us. And so every man's going to tell you how good he is. He's going to tell you all of his friends and family and neighbors and everybody that listen about his accomplishments. But who can be real with themselves? Who can really have that honest objectivity within themselves? Who can be really faithful to who they are? The righteous man walks in his integrity, and his children are blessed after him. A king who sits on the throne of judgment scatters all evil with his eyes. If you have a king, a righteous king, one who's going to judge good from evil, bad from not bad, just as eyes are enough to strike fear into people and scatter evil. I love that. Who can say, I have made my heart clean, I am pure from my sin? If you underline this, you might want to make a note beside it. This is the ultimate rhetorical question. You know what a rhetorical question is, right? It's a question that it's like the answer is so obvious it doesn't need to be answered. Who can say, I have made my heart clean? No one. Who can say, I am pure from sin? Less than that. Fewer than that. It's the ultimate rhetorical question, I think. Diverse weights and diverse measures. We talked about that earlier. It's about somebody that would have a weight when he buys and another weight for when he sells. It's dishonesty in businesses. Diverse weights and diverse measures, they are both alike, an abomination to the Lord. Even a child is known by his deeds. So we understand that adults are, obviously, but it says here, even a child is, whether what he does is pure and right. The hearing ear, this is verse 12, the hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord has made them both. Most of what we learn is either through our eyes or through our ears, right? I mean, we read things, we see things, we hear things. Almost virtually everything that we take into our brains as learning comes through one of those two gates, those two senses. And he's saying, the Lord has made them both. For me, I mean, we can look at God's creation, and what is more beautiful than a gorgeous sunset? And, when just everything is just right and there's just the right amount of clouds and they're right at the right angle and just everything turns pink and orange and explodes, even here, I've seen the sunset over the Pacific and in various other settings, and I've seen the sunrise over Galilee, and just to be able to see those sort of things, just God's creation, or you look up at the cosmos at night and wow. And then for me, like you think of sounds that are good, there's good music and things like that. But for me, the most beautiful sound is the sound of children playing at a swimming pool when you're just a couple hundred yards away, and just that sound of the laughter and the screaming and the splashing and everything. That, to me, that's one of the most endearing sounds that could ever be heard. And what Solomon is saying is that almost everything that we hear, almost everything that we learn comes in through our eyes and through our ears. And we can just think of all the things that we like, that we engage our eyes and our ears in doing. He says, just don't forget it's from the Lord. that this is something that the Lord gave us. And in so doing, when we do that, then the things that we see and the things that we hear, we will actually use them as means of praise. Do not love sleep, lest you come to poverty. I'm probably going to be a poor man, I guess. That's a hard one. Oh, open your eyes and you'll be satisfied with bread. How about this one, verse 14? It's good for nothing, says the buyer. But then when he's gone his way, he boasts. I know that's an F-150 Raptor, but it's just a beater. The thing barely runs. And it was, or if he's trying to sell some like 30-year-old rusted out bucket that was only driven by an old lady to church on Sundays. And there's always this whenever you go into. Usually it's kind of any sort of emerging world situation, but because I've done this in every place, you go to the markets and it's all about bargaining, and of course the guy that the merchant's going to tell you about how valuable this item is and how much it was cost to make, and tell you about all his hardships and how he can't sell it for any less because he's got all these bills he has to pay and all this, and then you'll bargain with him and you'll argue with him and you'll talk him down, and then you'll finally go from $100 down to $1.95, and then you'll walk away boasting about how you pulled over on him. Oh boy, did I get over on that old man back there. And you realize he's not going to sell it for anything less than he paid for it. I mean, he wouldn't have sold it to you, if it was less than what he paid for it. So, who got over who? There is gold in a multitude of rubies. Or there is gold and a multitude of rubies, but the lips of knowledge are a precious jewel. Take the garment of one who is surety for a stranger and hold it as a pledge when it's for a seductress. The Living Bible says it this way, just the original Ken Taylor Living Bible. It's risky to make loans to strangers. Or the Good News Bible kind of expands on it a little bit more. Anyone stupid enough to promise to be responsible for a stranger's debts ought to have their own property held to guarantee payment. Makes sense, Bread gained by deceit, verse 17, is sweet to a man, but afterward his mouth is filled with gravel. Not that this was gained by deceit, but I think this is somewhat where Solomon was talking about. And I've shared this story with many people before. Some of you have probably heard it. But years ago, when we were in the Philippines on a mission trip, and we had a day or two of break in between while some other people had gone off to do some other things, we were waiting for them to come back. And so the pastor that was our host there in the city that we were in, he was an American who had gone over there to pioneer the church. And he was telling us about the things that we could do on our off time. And he says, but when you're dealing with the locals, they're all going to haggle with you for prices and everything. And don't give in to them, because then you make it harder for us. So you gotta always, pay the bottom dollar for everything. Okay. So I decided I was going to go into town and just do a little window shopping. And so I hailed what they call a pedicab, which is a Honda 120 with a sidecar on it. That you can put about 10 people in, And so I flagged one down, and the typical fee for going anywhere in a pedicab was 1 peso. They use pesos over there. So this place we were staying was kind of out a little bit on the edge of town, a little outside of town. So I asked the pedicab driver, I said, how much to go into town? He said, 2 pesos. And I'm remembering what this pastor had told me, and I said, no, 1 peso. And he goes, no, it's a long way. It's 2 pesos. And I said, no, I can walk. 1 peso. And he goes, please, sir, 2 pesos. And I said, 1 peso or I'm going to walk. You're going that way anyway. He goes, okay, 1 peso. So I got in the back got it there in the sidecar, and I'm just thinking, boy, I'm a seasoned world traveler here. And I was feeling so proud of myself. And we got there, and I got out, I handed him the peso, and I started walking off into the crowd. And then all of a sudden it dawned on me that I had just argued over a nickel. That what we were talking about was the difference between a nickel and a dime. And this guy was probably going home to a grass hut with a mud floor. And I was so busted by that, and I turned around real quick to try to find him. And I never did see him after that. I think this is kind of, I wasn't being deceitful, but I was so proud of myself until I realized what I had done. And then it was like my mouth filled with gravel. Plans are established by counsel, and by wise counsel wage war. He who goes about as a talebearer reveals secrets. Therefore, do not associate one who flatters with his lips. New International Version says it this way: a gossip betrays a confidence, so avoid a man who talks too much. Pretty clear. Whoever curses his father or his mother, his lamp will be put out in deep darkness. I don't know what that is exactly. I know it's not good having your lamp put out in deep darkness. I know that's not something I want to do. But I think there's a whole major part of this verse that's pretty self-explanatory. He who curses his mother and father is going to have his lamp put out in a deep darkness. That's not something I want to do. I'd like my lamp to not even be put out, regardless of how dark it was. An inheritance gained hastily at the beginning will not be blessed at the end. If it's easy come, it's easy go. Do not say, I will recompense evil. Wait for the Lord, and he will save you. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. Diverse weights, again, are an abomination to the Lord, and dishonest scales are not good. A man's steps are of the Lord. How then can a man understand his own way? I think it's kind of frivolous, and I'll run into people every once in a while that just think they've got this all nailed, but I think it's kind of frivolous for us to say that we can fully wrap our brains all the way around free will and and God's predestination. To say that I fully understand that God has made me a free moral agent with I have the freedom to do whatever I want to, and then the fact that God is so totally sovereign, not just sovereign over the big things in life, but he's totally sovereign, completely. It's his attributes. One of his attributes is that of sovereignty. And to say that we completely understand that, I think is short-sighted. Man's steps are of the Lord. So how can he fully understand how it's going? It is a snare for a man to devote rashly something as holy, and then afterward to reconsider his vows. The word to devote here in the Old King James says, one who devoureth that which is holy. And that's kind of weak. But it's the idea that if you make a rash promise to God, you might end up eating your words later, is the meaning here. And I think maybe the Old King James is kind of paraphrasing a little bit. But then I think it's also very foolish to never commit anything. And say, well, I don't want to eat my words, so I'm just not going to do anything. I think that's kind of foolish too. A wise king sifts out the wicked and brings the threshing wheel over them. The spirit of a man is the lamp of the Lord, searching all the inner depths of his heart. Mercy and truth preserve the king, and by loving kindness he upholds his throne. The glory of young men is their strength. I love this. The splendor of the old men is their gray head. I'm going to let you guys underline that while I get a drink. I think that's an important one. And some of us have more splendor than others, I can say. I think what he's saying, beyond just simply, it's kind of cool to be young and have virility and strength and vim and vigor, but then it's also cool to be old and have the dignity that should be associated with that. But I think what he's saying is we should act our age both ways, Blows that hurt cleanse away evil. And some of us, as do stripes, the inner depths of the heart. Blows that hurt cleanse away evil, as do stripes, the inner depths of the heart. Again, the good news, sometimes it takes a painful experience to make us change our ways. Okay, verse 21, or chapter 21. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, like the rivers of water. He turns it wherever he wishes. Now, this is not saying that the king is a robot, just like I was saying earlier about man's free will and God's predestination. But God's going to get what he wants to get accomplished. He's going to get it accomplished through the king. The Lord establishes those who are in power, and He does so for a reason. He's trying to get something accomplished. He brought very weak and evil kings into Israel at the end of their kingdom because it was time for them to be judged. Every way of a man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the hearts. One of the most difficult things that I have, not only as a Christian, but just as a human being, is looking at myself with complete objectivity. To be able to look at myself and judge myself rightly. To not beat myself up too much for my weaknesses, or not give myself too much credit when I accomplish something. I would really beat myself up over that fact if it weren't for the fact that I know I'm not the only one. In fact, Jeremiah, he declares in Jeremiah 17:9, the very classic verse, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? And then David in Psalm 139, one of the great Psalms, says in verse 23, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxieties, and see if there's any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." So you got Jeremiah saying, my heart is deceitful. That's beyond even understanding. And then David's saying, well, search my heart and see if there's anything deceitful in it. And Jeremiah is saying, you don't have to search me, God. I already know it's deceitful. And I just want to bring it to you and have you cleanse it. And that's what David is saying here. Cleanse my heart and remove anything that is not there. To do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. A haughty look and a proud spirit, or a proud heart, and the plowing of the wicked are sin. So this isn't one of those antithetical ones. This isn't a first line and then but beginning the second line. This has an and in it. And it says the haughty look and the proud heart and the plowing of the wicked are sin, which is kind of interesting couplet. The plans of the diligent lead surely to plenty, but those of everyone who is hasty surely to poverty. The get-rich schemes hardly ever work. That's what he's saying. Getting treasures by a lying tongue is the fleeting fantasy of those who seek death. The violence of the wicked will destroy them, but because they refuse to do justice. The way of a guilty man is perverse, but as for the pure, his work is right. Better to dwell in the corner of a housetop than in a house shared with a contentious woman. He's gone from a dripping faucet to the corner of the rooftop. I could say, really, we're talking about the subject of marriage and husbands and wives, and I can say without any hesitation or qualification at all that Sherry is my best friend. My wife Sherry. I would rather spend time with her than I would with anybody else. And I like spending time with other people. I love all y'all. But she is definitely my best friend. But one of the reasons why that is, it didn't just happen. It wasn't just because we naturally grew together. But one of the reasons why she is my best friend is because she made it her goal to be my best friend. She, like the previous proverb, somebody who wants to be his friend, wants to have friends, must himself be friendly. And she made that her goal. She desired to be my best friend, and she drew me with that. So this is the antithesis of that. Soul of the wicked desires evil. His neighbor finds no favor in his eyes. When the scoffer is punished, the simple is made wise. You take somebody who's a scoffer, or somebody that's always negative, somebody that's always making fun of somebody or saying something bad or something like that. When he gets busted, then even the simple people heed. They learn from that. But when the wise is instructed, he receives knowledge. The righteous God wisely considers the house of the wicked, overthrowing the wicked for their wickedness. Whoever shuts his ears to the cry of the poor will also cry himself and not be heard. There are those that are the poor that the Bible calls poor. And this is kind of hard in our culture, in our society. Back in the Bible times, there were people that were poor. I mean, they were wretchedly destitute. They were dependent upon the good graces of other people just to be able to eat their next meal. It's hard to know when you see people on the exit ramps and so forth. It's hard to know whether they are actually. There was a period of my life when I was homeless. Not everybody knows this, but I was homeless for a time period. It was a few months, but it was by desire. I mean, or not by desire, but by choice. I chose not to work. I chose not to be responsible. It was before Sherry and I met and got married. And, there are those who are poor that the Bible calls poor, and there are those who are just too lazy to go get a job that the Bible calls just too lazy to go get a job. The Bible makes the distinction between them, and I think we should oftentimes strive to do so too. A gift in secret pacifies anger, and a bribe behind the back strong wrath. It's a joy for the just to do justice, but the destruction will come to the workers of iniquity. A man who wanders from the way of understanding will rest in the assembly of the dead. Boy, that's one that Solomon should have heeded strongly, isn't it? He who loves pleasure will be a poor man, and he who loves wine and oil will not be rich. Now, there's nothing wrong with pleasure. I like pleasure. I'm sure everybody here likes pleasure. But what he says is, it's the love of pleasure that will make me a poor man. Just like it's the love of money that is the root of all evil. It's the love of pleasure that will lead to poverty. The wicked shall be a ransom for the righteous, and the unfaithful for the upright. Now, we're going from the dripping faucet to the corner of the rooftop to the middle of the desert. It's better to dwell in the wilderness than with a contentious and angry woman. So it was a contentious woman earlier. Now she's a contentious and angry woman. She can drive you all the way out in the middle of the Mojave. Anyone that ever thinks that Solomon was just simply a woman hater with the things that he says has never lived with an angry and contentious woman. I can tell you that for sure. There is a desirable treasure and oil in the dwelling of the wise, but a foolish man squanders it. He who follows righteousness and mercy finds life, righteousness, and honor. A wise man scales the city of the mighty and then brings down the trusted stronghold. What this is saying is that there's the planning, there's the preparation that goes into, let's say, taking a city, and the wise man is going to do that, and they'll be able to accomplish their goal if they do it wisely. And beyond just simply, that's just a metaphor for using wisdom in the application of your daily activities. And when you do that, then you'll accomplish your goals. Whoever guards his mouth and tongue keeps his soul from troubles. There's so many times that I've said things that I wish I could take back, but you can't unsay something. But if I got to be honest, the main reason why I wish I could take something back is so that I could cover up what I was wanting to say, for the damage that I did and what I said, the embarrassment that I caused myself. And whoever guards his mouth and tongue keeps his soul from troubles. If you don't, you got problems. A proud and haughty man, scoffer is his name. Now, your Bible may translate that differently. There are several different ways that that's rendered, but a proud and haughty man, scoffer is his name. He acts with arrogant pride. The desire of the lazy man kills him, for his hands refuse to labor. He covets greedily all day long, but the righteous gives and does not spare. How many times when you're driving around on I-44 and you see the balance of the lotto, 100 gazillion millions is the lotto right now, and you think, maybe I ought to go buy one. Boy, what could I do with $100 gazillion? He covets greedily all day long. He covets greedily all day long, but the righteous gives and does not spare. The sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination. How much more when he brings it with wicked intent? You know, I think God, for the wicked, the man who does not live righteously, for them to come and bring their sacrifice, you know, which in the Bible days that was actually bringing a sacrifice. But whether it's the sacrifice of our lips, of singing praise songs, or the writing of a tithe check, or whatever it may be, whatever his offering to the Lord might be, if it's a man that doesn't live righteously, God doesn't like that. He doesn't receive that. He doesn't accept it. But when it's done with the wrong intention as well, you know, when it's done for the purpose of maybe putting on a show, or for the purpose of, you know, they've heard a sermon about how you can't outgive God, and so they're going to get that 100-fold return, or whatever it might be. You know, he hates all of the offerings of the wicked, but when it's done with evil intent, wicked intent, much more so. A false witness shall perish, verse 28, but a man who hears him will cry endlessly, or will speak endlessly. You know, the false witness is, I mean, he's going to say his words, and then the lie is going to die, except the man who hears it's going to carry it on and continue it on, and then the person that hears that's going to continue it on. And you know, what is it? A lie goes all the way around the world before the truth puts on its shoes. Something like that. A wicked man hardens his face, but as for the upright, he establishes his way. There is no wisdom or understanding or counsel against the Lord. You know, you just ain't going to beat him. Now, this isn't saying that we shouldn't bone up on our apologetics, you know, or it's that we shouldn't know what we believe and why we believe it. It's not saying that we shouldn't be civically minded and be involved in the process to kind of somehow stem within the political arena of trying to stem this tide of godlessness that's sweeping through our country, or anything like that. You know, it's not saying that we should just kind of sit home and watch the Home Shopping Network. You know, it's not what he's saying. But what he's saying is they ain't going to win. Those that are against God are going to lose. You know, false doctrines and false teachers come and go. The horse is prepared for the day of battle, but deliverance is of the Lord. You know, there was the thing back in the, I can't remember if it was the Revolutionary War or the Civil War, in the very beginning, when they used to have, you know, they would use the cap and ball firing mechanisms for the rifles. And there was a thing of praise the Lord and keep your powder dry. You know, in other words, you're going to go into the battle and you're going to be praising Him. You're going to have your mind focused on Him. You're going to see Him as being your deliverance. But at the same time, you got to keep your powder dry, because your powder gets wet, so your gun's not going to shoot. And this is kind of the reverse of that. You know, the horse is prepared for the day of battle. The powder is kept dry. The horse is prepared for the day of battle. You get the horse that's all got all the stuff on it that needs to fight the enemy, but you do all of that. You do all the preparations. You keep your powder dry, but you got to remember that the victory is going to belong to the Lord. Let's pray. Wise words, Lord, not from a man who was failed and did not follow much of what is said in this book and most of his life, but the words are from you. And your words are true regardless of whose lips they come from. And so let us heed them, Lord. Let us learn what the life of the wise is like, and let us eschew the life of the foolish, and let us pursue your ways in all ours. This we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.